Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 40. This episode we rejoin Brigadier Etienne Gerard for more mishaps and misadventures, this time on British soil in The Brigadier in England from 1903. And here's Paul to set the scene.
Before I start on my synopsis, I'll just explain that The Brigadier in England is actually a sequel to How the King Held the Brigadier, a story which we covered in episode 15. Having recovered from his unsuccessful escape attempt across Dartmoor, Brigadier Gerard is living under comfortable house arrest at High Combe, the Dartmoor home of Lord Ruffton. There are many diversions as Gerard whiles away the time until he can return to his Emperor and his beloved Hussars of Conflans. High Combe provides shooting and cricket, boxing and drunken evenings with Lord Ruffton's rough and ready sporting companions. And there is Ruffton's beautiful sister, Lady Jane Dacre. Of course, Gerard falls in love with her and is convinced that the sentiment is reciprocated. But one day, this idyll is shattered by the arrival of the forbidding Lord George Dacre, Lady Jane's estranged husband, who wants her back.
Now, we talked about the origins of the character of Brigadier Gerard when we looked at how the Brigadier held the King and how the King held the Brigadier back in episode 15. And those stories featured in the first series, The Exploits of Brigadier Gerard, which were collected and published in 1896. And that might have been the end for the Brigadier, but in a mirror of what happened with Sherlock Holmes, he reappeared for a one-off adventure, in his case in January 1900, entitled The Crime of the Brigadier, also known somewhat spoilerifically as How the Brigadier Slew the Fox. Now, he would reappear again 2 years later in 1902 in what was a really eventful year for Conan Doyle. His book, The War in South Africa, Its Cause and Conduct, came out in January and ultimately earned him a knighthood. It was also in January that the Gillette play Sherlock Holmes was performed before Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. And in March, The Hound of the Baskervilles concluded and was published in book form to widespread and popular acclaim. But the events of that year also left Conan Doyle physically and mentally exhausted, and his doctor ordered him a rest. And so in April 1902, Conan Doyle set off on a 3-week tour of Europe for a well-earned break. His first stop was to Gaiola, a tiny island off the coast of Naples in Italy, owned by his sister Ida and her husband Nelson Foley. And it was here that Conan Doyle encountered Augusto Bontempi, the inventor of a sculpting machine, which he subsequently invested in without a great deal of success. Ross Davies and I recently gave a presentation on that saga, which you can find a link to in the show notes. After the trip to Gaiola, Conan Doyle carried on to Venice, and it was here that he hit upon the idea for a new Gerard story, which he wrote up on the rest of his travels and gleefully told his mother would pay his expenses. That story appeared in the Strand as How the Brigadier Lost His Ear, and kicked off the second series of Gerard tales, which were entitled in the Strand The Adventures of Etienne Gerard, and began in August 1902. Now, that series would see Gerard in the peninsula, in Russia, on the battlefield of Waterloo, or at least very close nearby, and in England in the 6th of the new series, which is our story today, The Brigadier in England. Now, that story was submitted to the Strand at Christmas 1902, but almost certainly had its origins earlier in the year, back in August, when Conan Doyle was busy playing cricket for the MCC on a tour of Devon and Cornwall and stopped off at Tavistock, where he had, in his early days in medical practice, considered setting up a surgery. Now, notably, cricket, Devon and Tavistock feature in The Brigadier in England. When Conan Doyle submitted the story to Greenhouse Smith, he wrote, "Brigadier number 6. It verges on the farcical, I fear, but I can't help it." And the story was eventually published in the Strand in March 1903, the same month that Conan Doyle's Brigadier Gerard play was first performed with Lewis Waller in the title role. And a few months later, it was collected in Adventures of Gerard, in which it was renamed How the Brigadier Triumphed in England to make the title more consistent with the rest of the series. And in many ways, this is a story of two halves, really. It opens ostensibly with a series of sort of comic sketches, largely themed around the British love of sport. And here, Conan Doyle actually opens the story by having a second bite at that cherry that is the crime of the Brigadier. It won't be the last time he will do that either. He obviously was so amused by the story that he decided he was going to have another swipe at it each time he got an opportunity. And I think this opening sequence is really wonderful, and it all plays around Gerard's misunderstanding of British protocols of sport, and particularly there are two right at the outset there: the pheasant hunting, where Gerard essentially, instead of going out hunting with Lord Ruffton, he's going to sneak up on the pheasants and kill them all in the sleep. And the second is cricket, where he fundamentally misunderstands the game and believes that instead the purpose of the game is to is to hit the batsman with the ball. And so we get this wonderful sequence where Gerard comes in to bowl, says, "Ah, my friends, the hour of my triumph had come. It was a red waistcoat that he wore, and at this I hurled the ball. You would have said that I was a gunner, not a hussar, for never was so straight an aim. With the despairing cry, the cry of the brave man who was beaten, he fell upon the wooden pegs behind him, and they all rolled upon the ground together. It was for me, the victor, to rush forward to embrace this intrepid player, and to raise him to his feet with words of praise and encouragement and hope. He was in pain and could not stand erect, yet the honest fellow confessed that there was no accident in my victory. He did it a purpose. He did it a purpose." It's wonderful. And then from there, you get into his next sporting mishap, which is an old favourite of Conan Doyle's, which is boxing.
Yes, and this is where Gerard follows on from his last adventure, How the King Held the Brigadier, during which his escape attempt from Dartmoor is held up by a boxer in training, the Bristol Bustler, and again Gerard misunderstands the whole rules of boxing, and he seems to have a fondness for kicking people, not realizing this is out of the rules. So again, at Lord Ruffton's house, there is a gathering of Regency gentlemen, and one of them is a character named Gerard refers to him as the Honourable Baldock, which you wonder, is this Gerard mishearing the word bulldog?
Yes.
as Baldock? But somehow a boxing match between Gerard and Baldock occurs in the evening, during which Gerard headbutts him in the stomach, kicks him, bites him, and it's the responses of the other characters are just brilliant to this, as well as the actual two combatants.
Yes.
And just the comic potential that Doyle gets out of this is wonderful, and it comes, of course, from the fact that he loves the sport.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's this understanding of the sport and the love of the sport, and also an understanding of the sport's inherent brutality and ridiculousness.
Yes.
And this idea that it's fine to slug someone in the face, but to headbutt them in the stomach or to kick them is just not on. And this he's playing on this constantly. It's very funny, very clever at the same time.
It is. Yes, his first half is all this exploration of boorish pugilists and and hale and hearty Regency types, and principal among them is Lord Ruffton, who is Gerard's host in England, and Lord Ruffton is first mentioned in How the King Held the Brigadier as one of the backers of the Bristol Bustler, that great boxing character from that earlier story, and we discover here in England that Ruffton had ridden with the police when they had pursued Gerard across the moors. Gerard thinking he was escaping the prison when in fact everybody was pursuing him to tell him he'd been reprieved. But actually Ruffton is a character who extends into other Conan Doyle works as well. So he actually reappeared in The House of Temperley, which is a play based on Rodney Stone and was first performed in 1909. And then his scene in Temperley was later adapted by Conan Doyle into a rather wonderful, very late short story, The End of Devil Hawker, which came out in 1930. And in fact, it was one of the last stories that Conan Doyle was working on. It's believed that the galley proofs were on his desk the day that he died. And The End of Devil Hawker concerns a cards scandal at Watier's, one of the great Regency clubs, where Ruffton is one of the members with Lord Byron, and in the presence of other members and the great boxer Tom Cribb, they investigate the behaviour of Sir John Hawker, who is accused of cheating at cards. And Ruffton reflects this kind of fascination that Conan Doyle had with the Regency period, and the fact that he through a number of stories, such as those already mentioned, but also things like A Foreign Office Romance, which we covered in episode 28, he keeps returning to this Regency world, and each time he adds other layers to it as well. He obviously has a fascination with the Regency period and creates a really rich environment.
Yes, and it's not only in the stories set in this kind of very English Regency world. We also have a different version of Gerard. Appears in a novel which Doyle was very dissatisfied with, Uncle Bernac.
Mm.
And so he's constantly tweaking this stuff and tweaking the characters and reworking and obviously finding his way around this world. And as you say, Mark, almost trying to invent in a very modern way his own universe for
Yes.
these characters.
Yeah, he does. In fact, we might even get a bit of this sort of drifting into the Sherlock Holmes stories as well, because in the disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax from 1911, Lady Frances is said to be the sole survivor of the direct family of the late Earl of Ruffton.
Mm.
So presumably that means that Sherlock Holmes exists in the Gerard universe, or vice versa.
Mm. And as we'll find out later as we discuss this particular story, there is this connection as well with the disappearance of Francis Carfax. It is again about abduction.
Yes, yeah, of course.
Yeah, this whole world of Regency bucks and dandies and sportsmen really had a great appeal for Doyle. And his description in this, when Gerard is at the evening events
Mm.
in High Combe, it's quite wonderful. You get, of an evening, many sportsmen would assemble at the house of Lord Ruffton, where they would drink much wine, make wild bets, and talk of their horses and their foxes. They were the same stamp, all of them, drinkers, madcaps, fighters, gamblers, full of strange caprices and extraordinary whims. So you've really got a wonderful sort of character type
Yes.
being painted here. And one of the main sources Doyle used was the wonderful 2-volume the reminiscences and recollections of Captain Gronow, which was published in the early 1860s. And Gronow was an officer of the Guards, the first foot guards, the Grenadier Guards, in the Napoleonic Wars. But his reminiscences aren't purely military.
No.
It's a whole social reminiscence of this time. And he describes these sort of characters brilliantly, and obviously he knew them.
Yes.
So this is really good first-hand primary source for these sort of characters, and it's quite a long quote, but I think just gives the whole flavour so well, and it's obvious that Conan Doyle had paid close attention to what Gronow had to say. Drinking and play were more universally indulged in then than at the present time, and many men still living must remember the couple of bottles of port at least which accompanied his dinner in those days. Indeed, female society amongst the upper classes was most notoriously neglected, except perhaps by romantic foreigners, who were the heroes of many a fashionable adventure that fed the clubs with ever-acceptable scandal. How could it be otherwise when husbands spent their days in the hunting field, or were entirely occupied with politics, and always away from home during the day, whilst the dinner party, commencing at 7 or 8, frequently did not break up before 1 in the morning? There were 4 and even 5 bottle men, and the only thing that saved them was drinking very slowly and out of very small glasses. The learned head of the law, Lord Eldon, and his brother Lord Stowell, used to say that they had drunk more bad port than any 2 men in England. Indeed, the former was rather apt to be overtaken, and to speak occasionally somewhat thicker than natural after long and heavy potations. The late Lords Penmure, Dufferin, and Blaney, wonderful to relate, were 6 bottle men at this time, and I really think that if the good society of 1815 could appear before their more moderate descendants in the state they were generally reduced to after dinner, the moderns would pronounce their ancestors fit for nothing but bed. And these are the sorts of characters that are being depicted in this story, and just scene setting. It's quite wonderful, and you can really see how Doyle has paid close attention and been influenced by these sort of reports.
Yes, and we know he read extremely widely on the Regency, on all aspects of the Regency. I mean, I think when we covered previously, I think Foreign Office Romance, and possibly in the episode on Croxley Master, the fact that he was interested in books like Pugilistica, the great history of the origins of boxing. And we know from his sort of Regency notebooks that he took copious notes on major Regency boxing figures, people like John Gully. And his fascination with those sort of characters is something that you see echoed in other authors' works. I mean, Paul, you've spotted a sort of connection between the kind of fighting scenes here and fighting scenes adopted by other admirers of Conan Doyle in their works.
Yeah, in particular, where we have the box fight between Gerard and Bulldog. Just reading the dialogue and the language in that, I was very much reminded of Royal Flash,
Yes,
by George MacDonald Fraser, published in 1970, in which Flash and his gang go back to their club, and there that night is Otto von Bismarck visiting England, and the aforementioned John Gully, who actually went on quite a social journey. He started out as a butcher, failed at that, and was taught boxing in prison. In a debtor's prison, and was taken out of that by the fancy, who saw his talent, and he actually built his way up to becoming an MP.
Yes.
So went from the prize ring to the Commons. Is there enormous difference? Make your own mind up. But in this episode in Royal Flash, Bismarck becomes interested in boxing and wants to learn it, and there's the best teacher in the world, John Gully, and it gets a bit out of hand, and again Bismarck is using techniques that just aren't allowed. He throws Gully at one point. Both men lose their temper, and it ends up very messily. So you've got this reference, and I'm sure Fraser. We know Fraser was a huge fan of Conan Doyle, and he actually wrote an introduction to an edition of the Gerard stories. So he was very, very familiar with this, and very much approved of Doyle's boxing stories. And in fact, later on, 1997, produced his own Regency boxing novel, Black Ajax.
Yes.
So these traditions go on.
Yeah. And that scene from Royal Flash is wonderful in the movie, isn't it? Where you have Oliver Reed as Otto von Bismarck squaring up against Henry Cooper.
Henry Cooper, our Henry.
And that's pretty much the focus of the first third of this story, is this kind of the vulgar manners of the fancy. And it's really around their sort of male manners and etiquette while in their own company. The second half is much more around sort of manners and etiquette in polite society, as we see Gerard become infatuated with Lady Dacre. And here this really put me in mind of the other great Regency novelists. I mean, obviously we have we've talked previously about the sort of great Gothic novelists from the period, people like Wollstonecraft and Polidori, and obviously the writings of people like Byron as well. But then the two great writers I think so I associate with the Regency are, of course, Walter Scott, who we've covered and mentioned several times, but also Jane Austen. And Jane Austen's novels of a polite society are something that almost this story almost pastiches in a kind of way. It sort of comes at it from the male point of view, as it were. And for all we know that Conan Doyle read Austen, he didn't really have very much to say about her works. She only really gets mentioned in Through the Magic Door, and in the context of the Brontes representing a break from what he called the Miss Austen-like calm of the writings that had gone before. And then in 1894, he was interviewed by Robert Barr for The Idler, and he suggested that Trollope shared a line of ancestry with Austen.
Yes, it's interesting that it's this time he mentions that, because in 1893 we know he read Pride and Prejudice whilst he was living in South Norwood. He mentions this in a letter to his mother, in which he says that he liked Austen's easy, prim, subdued style.
But he also clearly sort of distances himself from that style of writing. In that same interview with Barr, he talks about how different schools of writing can exist alongside each other, and says, one can like Valdez and Bourget and Miss Austen without throwing stones at Scott or Thackeray and Dickens, which is an interesting statement in itself, because, of course, I think Conan Doyle would position himself much more with Scott and Thackeray and Dickens than he would with Austen and others as well. But for all he doesn't really see himself sharing sort of Austen's company, he is really playing on some of the sort of things that you might associate with Austen, particularly when you have Gerard mooning after Lady Dacre. There are some wonderful, wonderful sequences with him stood by the piano. I particularly like this moment. I was reserved, I was discreet. I tried to curb my emotions and to discourage hers. For my own part, I feared that I betrayed myself, for the eye becomes more eloquent when the tongue is silent. Every quiver of my fingers as I turned over her music sheets told her my secret. And then he's watching after her longingly and says, for hours she would sit in a sweet melancholy while I admired her pale face and her curls in the lamplight, and thrilled within me to think that I had moved her so deeply. But of course, she isn't moved at all. Who she's actually thinking about is probably Lord Dacre, her bully of a husband, who she's about to be reunited with. But you get this play of Conan Doyle playing on all the kind of manners and etiquettes of the kind of Austen novels, and playing it from a male point of view. You actually get another writer does something similar, Patrick O'Brien, when he wrote the second of the Aubrey Maturin novels, Post Captain, in 1972, which is very much like Austen's Persuasion, but from the male point of view.
Yeah, and there was also another approach taken to the Regency novel in the 1840s by William Makepeace Thackeray and Vanity Fair, which again goes into the lot of the niceties of social behaviour and so on, but also how that social behaviour can be used by an ambitious climber, Becky Sharp. So you've got that side to it as well, and Vanity Fair was certainly an important book to Conan Doyle. He actually rated it as one of the three novels which I admire most in the Victorian era. The other two being Charles Reade's The Cloister and the Hearth and George Meredith's The Ordeal of Richard Feverel.
Yeah.
But Doyle also had a family connection to William Makepeace Thackeray, in that Thackeray had been a close friend of Arthur's uncle, Richard or Dickie Doyle. And Thackeray had written for Punch when Dickie Doyle was a leading artist on that publication, and they continued their friendship after Richard had left Punch. And Richard also illustrated The Newcomes. So there's this very, very kind of close family connection. And Charles, Arthur's father, also knew Thackeray, who visited Charles in 1851 when he was up delivering a series of lectures in Edinburgh. Now, Arthur Conan Doyle, in Memories and Adventures, said, "It pleases me to think that I have sat on Thackeray's knee." It's a moot point. Thackeray died when Arthur was 4. As I say, we know he went up in 1851. We don't know fully if he visited afterwards, but it's a nice idea.
Yeah.
So it'd be nice to think that generations of writers, this kind of domestic picture works very nicely. But yeah, you've got this as Doyle is writing his Regency stories, the various types. He will have had Thackeray and Vanity Fair in the background. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think so. And particularly when we get to the second part of this story, which is really concerned with Lady Dacre and the fact that she gets abducted by her husband, and this leads to this dramatic duel between Lord Dacre and Gerard. But I do wonder if there's a touch of the sort of story of Emmy Smedley in this from Vanity Fair, who marries George Osborne, not to be confused with the former Chancellor, but a similarly flawed character who is in Vanity Fair. George Osborne is prone to gambling and laden with debts, and eventually propositions Emmy's friend Becky Sharp on the eve of Waterloo, no less, and then promptly dies at Waterloo, and leaving Emmy pregnant and impoverished. And, in the end, Emmy gets together with the right man. There's a bit of a happy ending for her, but But yeah, I do wonder if there's something in this kind of the poor character of Lord Dacre. Conan Doyle describes Lord Dacre this way: his name, it seems, was a household word throughout all England for every sort of mischief: wine, women, dice, cards, racing. In all forms of debauchery, he had earned for himself a terrible name. He was of an old and noble family, and it had been hoped that he had sowed his wild oats when he married the beautiful Lady Jane Ruffton. Lord Dacre then kidnaps Lady Dacre, and it is this that has Ruffton enlist the help of Gerard to head off to Dacre's wonderfully named manor house, Gravel Hanger, to rescue her.
Yeah, and this extra plot line is an interesting detail at this point in Conan Doyle's writing career, because we have this short story set on Dartmoor, and the previous year, the book version of The Hound of the Baskervilles had been published, and the Hound, of course, features as part of the legend the wicked Sir Hugo Baskerville abducting local farmer's daughter with his gang of no good cavaliers. And there's also it's a theme that Doyle had used before that. We go back to 1884 with a short story he had published in Bow Bells called The Tragedians, set in Paris, which has a rascally actor, Labla, who sets his heart on kidnapping this English Rose Latour. And it's the same sort of idea again, and we also see from the Tragedians and another idea which re-emerges in the Brigadier in England.
Yes, yeah, that's dueling, and of course, Gerard and Ruffton arrive at Gravel Hanger and instantly seek redress, and Conan Doyle was really fascinated by dueling. I think he wrote a really very learned and amusing article entitled "The Duello in France" for the Cornhill in December 1891, and it's a really interesting article in that it talks about how dueling is part of the French national character, and it goes into lots of sort of vignettes and case studies, as it were, of different famous duels, in a way to both enjoy them in their sort of romantic quality, but also then to make a final appeal that actually the French nation can't join the ranks of the civilized until it's turned its back on dueling. he actually goes on to say in the Duello in France, the blend of the many high-spirited nations which go to make up the French people, of the Gaul, the Armorican, the Frank, the Burgundian, the Norman, the Goth, has produced a race who appear to have the combative spirit more highly developed than any other European nation. In spite of the incessant wars which make up the history of France, the record of private combat and bloodshed is an unbroken one, stretching back in a long red stream through the ages, sometimes narrow, sometimes broad, occasionally reaching such a flood as can only be ascribed to a passing fit of universal homicidal mania. And then he says, recent events have shown that this national tendency is as strong as ever, and that there is every prospect that the duello, when driven from every other European country, may still find a home among a gallant people whose solicitude for their honour makes them occasionally a trifle neglectful of their intelligence. It's an astonishing statement. But within that, he actually covers off specifically dueling within the Regency period, although he makes a rather sweeping statement that the terrible wars of Napoleon put an end to dueling for the time, but the Restoration brought it forward again with renewed vigour. And I'm not sure that that's entirely true, is it, Paul?
No, not fully. It did still, find its way into French history in the later 19th century. And there's a famous duel that was fought by President Carnot. So it still goes on, but then it does in Britain as well. I mean,
Yeah,
it's this kind of, it does sound a trifle high-handed
it does.
to almost say that this is what the French delight in. I mean, the Germans, the students fought duels with the Schlager to get scars on their faces
Yes.
in the mid-19th century. So it was a German tradition. We might have outlawed it in Britain, but it still went on. And I mean, the Duke of Wellington fought more than one duel, including when he was Prime Minister,
Yes.
when it was supposed to be illegal. So it's a bit rich of Doyle to try and say this is a French trait.
Yes, it is indeed. He does when he concludes the duello in France, he does say, somewhat sheepishly, an Englishman can scarcely be censorious when he speaks of the duels of the past, for his own chronicles are too often stained by encounters as desperate as any across the channel. So throws away his entire argument in the last paragraph. But you're right about dueling in Regency London being made illegal, but it still continued and right to the top of society, in the sense that there was, you mentioned about Wellington later than the Regency period. Wellington is famously had a duel with the Earl of Winchelsea in 1829 when Winchelsea, who was an arch Protestant, objected to the sort of pro-Catholic reforms that Wellington was pushing through. And in that instance, as the injured party, Wellington got to fire first and missed, and Winchelsea fired into the air. But there was also, earlier than that, William Pitt fought a duel with George Tierney, an MP, in 1788, and both missed. And then in 1809, you have two serving cabinet ministers, Lord Castlereagh and the future Prime Minister George Canning, who was then Minister of War, both fought a duel. When Castlereagh heard Canning was trying to oust him, both men were deadly serious. They picked pistols, fired at each other simultaneously, both missed. And then it was on the second attempt that Canning managed to get Castlereagh in the thigh, and then they sort of called it quits at that point. But at that point, honour was satisfied. But as you say, the Tragedians by Conan Doyle in 1884 has got a famous duel in it. The premise being that Henry Latour is a Parisian actor. Again, it has to be set in France. It has to be the French who are dueling, and the person who is responsible is another actor, and they decide to take it out on each other in a live performance of Hamlet, where one is playing Laertes and one is playing Hamlet, and they decide to have a go at each other in much more realistic fashion in Act 5. And it's a wonderful sequence, isn't it? The duel is great, particularly, I think, for the inclusion of one character in particular, who is this supposedly impartial judge that they bring in, Colonel Barclay.
Well, it's again, as with the boxing, playing violence slightly for laughs.
Yes.
And almost diffusing the situation. I mean, it's interesting to look at the structure of the story as well, and that you start with all this kind of violent male buffoonery, and then a slight Austen-esque interlude,
Yes.
and then the violence is back.
It's back again.
The men are finding their way about again, and a crazy duel fought over a kitchen table.
Yes.
Almost, it's so the comic potential is there, and as you say, yes, the umpire
Mm.
that they bring in, Colonel Berkeley of the Guards, is a wonderful character, and I won't give it away because I think you've got to read
Yes.
the end of the duel for the full effect of this. It's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, Berkeley himself is a fantastic creation, and when Gerard first sees him, he describes him as a tall, thin Englishman with a great moustache, which is a rare thing amid that clean-shaven race. I have heard since that they were worn only by the Guards and the Hussars. This Colonel Berkeley was a Guardsman. Um, it, it's again one of these moot points. The British Army at the time was clean shaven, apart from the Hussars, because they were uh, deliberately styled on continental
Mm.
soldiers.
Mm.
We're not told whether Berkeley is actually foot guards or horse guards.
No.
If he's got the moustache, it's more likely that it'd be horse
Horse
guards.
guards.
But
Mm.
again, still frowned upon because the Duke of Wellington absolutely loathed facial hair. And we can come back to Vanity Fair on this one as well, because Thackeray points out that there was a craze
Mm.
at the time particularly around the time of Waterloo, for young British officers to grow mustachios. But they wouldn't last long because this it was just so frowned upon. So it is quite odd to have this senior guardsman wearing splendid moustache that would fit in more with the Victorian period.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, that puts me in mind of another thing that Conan Doyle says in this Duello in France, where he talks about the epoch of Louis XIII, and refers to somebody called de Bouteville, who was quote famous for his innumerable duels and interminable mustaches. And when he goes up to the scaffold for having fought a duel, the Bishop of Nantes says, "Do you still think of life?" To which de Bouteville replied, "I think only of my moustaches, the finest in France."
This again is part of Wellington's objection to moustaches, because they're so associated with the French army.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. But back to the story, and Lady Dacre ultimately is sort of reunited with Lord Dacre, and honor is satisfied, and without bloodshed. But in the end, the whole violence has proven to be totally unnecessary. But there is a nod to an interest that Conan Doyle would come to have fairly soon, which is his interest in divorce law reform. And we've mentioned this previously, that Conan Doyle eventually became president of the Divorce Law Reform Union in 1906. And in 1909, he wrote a very influential essay, Divorce Law Reform, which contributed to the establishment of a royal commission, which eventually, 14 years later, it was a very, very long time, paved the way really for the Matrimonial Causes Act in 1923, which sort of level the playing field a bit in terms of the legitimate reasons for divorce. I don't think Conan Doyle is seriously exploring these issues in this story in the way that he would in, for example, The Adventure of the Abbey Grange, or The Adventure of the Devil's Foot, or even as he sort of tentatively skirts around the issue in the story of B-24, one of the Round the Fire stories. But it is interesting that it's in there. It's something that we know we know now in hindsight was something that was going to occupy his mind for a great many years to come.
Yes, it is a strange approach to the issue in this story, and also it's one of its flaws to me is the characterisation of Lord George Dacre,
Mm.
who we're told is kind of almost the devil incarnate, and then he just
Yes.
unconvincingly turns into this man who's very sorry about his past,
Yes.
and wants to turn over a new leaf, and it's just done unconvincingly.
Yes. Yeah.
And again, you've got this almost dichotomy that the Gerard sees him, doesn't like him because he's jealous of him, of course,
Yes.
but also because he sees him as a brute. And Gerard's answer to the problem is easy, and I'm sure it's not one that Doyle argued for when he was president of the Divorce Law Reform Association. When Gerard's solution is, there is no divorce so quick and certain as that which I could give her, which is obviously using his barkers.
Indeed. Yeah, so I think it's a very entertaining story, this one. It's not one of the strongest of the Gerards, I don't think. It's one of the ones that I think doesn't have the kind of light and shade that you get in some of the best of the Gerards. It is indeed, as Conan Doyle said in his letter to Greenhouse Smith, one of the more flippant pieces, but I think it's enjoyable nonetheless.
Oh, absolutely, and as you said, it's almost just a nice interlude away from the usually military themed Gerard stories.
Yes, indeed, indeed.
Mm.
So that's it for this episode. You can find the show notes at doingsofdoyle.com. And if you'd like to sponsor the podcast, then you can find out details at the site as well about how you can do so on PayPal or on Patreon. And next time, we're looking at an altogether different story.
Oh, absolutely. In the next episode, Ancient Egypt meets Victorian England in the Mummy-tastic lot number 249.
And that's one of my favourites. So I very much look forward to that. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
You make much of this boxing, I see. No doubt it is interesting enough to see two of the lower orders slash each other with their fists. But surely well-bred men despair of this, no?
Well, Count, each country to its own game.
Splash it all over.